This time, it's all about standards. It's about trying to make your head and tail about what's going on. There are loads of standards out there. Most people are looking at WCAG, but WCAG is changing. How do you keep on top of that? Is WCAG the right thing for everything? A lot of people are really puzzled about how it works when it comes to things like mobile apps, especially native mobile apps. So how does that all work? And then there's loads of other numbers that get kind of thrown around, like section 508 and EN 301-549, and my own personal favorite, ISO 30071 part 1. None of those are particularly easy to remember. We're going to be trying to tell you why they're so important, and what they mean, especially what they mean for you. So I think it's going to be a really interesting session today. There's going to be lots of time to ask questions. So please pop your questions in the chat. We've got a lot of people on the call. So it's going to be, that's the best way of getting your questions to us. And then we'll make sure we get as many in the sessions that we've got for that. So just a quick agenda. We're going to be looking briefly at why standards are important, what standard to use for what, so what all of these mean, when would you use them. There's then a bit of a question time after that. We're then going to look at what's happening with WCAG. Whether it's 2.1, 2.2, 3.0, it's all happening. So how do you get on top of that? We're then going to look briefly about making your own guidelines, where that might be a useful thing because of a particular thing that you need. And then we're going to round it all together before some more questions by looking at ISO 30071 part 1 and literally how it kind of pulls all of these together so that companies understand how to get the best from things. But before we do all of that, I hope you would be happy to participate in a Slido. I don't know if you've used slido.com before. Probably we've been in pandemic lockdown and Zoom calls for long enough now that you all know this. But if you go to slido.com, there is a quick sort of survey on there. So if you go to slido.com or sly.do, you will arrive at a page that looks like this. If you put in as your code 30071, then what will happen is that you will appear in this summary of what's happening in the poll there. It will be really interesting. As I say, we've got an hour together and we want you to get the best out of that hour that we can get. So if there are particular things that are more or less interesting to you, it's good to know about it. So yeah, we've got 6 people already kind of putting things in there. And those of you who've done that already, you can look on the screen and you can see all of these kind of things moving up and down. Obviously, massively important for a lot of people seems to be WCAG, but we've got people interested in, if you like, how to do your own internal accessibility guidelines. That's good because that was an idea that I thought it would be good to include. So I popped that into the deck yesterday. I obviously got that one right, yay. Section 508, some Apple stuff, some things on EN 301-549, slightly less on VPAT so far. That's good. Okay, that gives me just a good idea that the stuff that I have in slides is going to be interesting to the people who have made it through onto the Zoom. I really appreciate it's 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. Hopefully this is going to be a lot of fun. Standards don't always kind of feel like fun, but I'm going to try and at least give it lots of energy and answer lots of questions. So the first section that we're going to look at is why are these standards so important, really? And I wanted to kind of reinforce one thing from the beginning, which is that I think standards are great because they help you make accessible products. Most people are still kind of hung up on the whole idea of standards being great for testing. But as you'll have seen if you've been to our website recently, we are just trying to kind of reinforce an idea which isn't new, and it almost shouldn't need to be said, it feels. But what we find is a huge number of organizations test their website's accessibility. Miles fewer actually kind of do something with the results and fix stuff. Miles fewer than that actually say guidelines are the things that we train our staff in, so that when we have those audits done, the stuff that comes out of it makes us smile rather than makes us cry. The really important thing for us is that you are actually not just testing things and getting depressed, but you're actually feeling empowered that you can do accessibility. And at their best, that is what a standard or a guideline is trying to do. The third thing is they help people tell you what level of something you need to get to. So legislators all over the world are kind of thinking, okay, do we put WCAG, do we say we need you to get to WCAG 2.1 AA, for example, all through the European Accessibility Act. It's there. Certainly here in the UK, our Equality Act actually doesn't say what level you need to get to, but it's still a very, very helpful thing to say, like this level rather than less or more. And fundamentally, if you're a digital agency or if you're working with a digital agency, to actually say we need a website which is accessible, standards are a really good way of saying, yeah, we need to get to that point. But it's a little bit more than just WCAG. And so I'm going to be taking us through standards in a hopefully a really kind of interesting way. The other thing about standards is they can be really annoying, because in the past, there were loads of different competing standards. And so people didn't know, am I supposed to be doing this or that or whatever? And something really great happened last year, which was the harmonization stuff that certainly has been happening in Europe. Really came through well. So this is Sherry Byrne-Haber, a colleague of mine in the States, saying, isn't it brilliant that Europe has now adopted EN 301549, and even the UK with Brexit is effectively in step with the rest of Europe. And a lot of the stuff which is happening out there is very much around those technical standards. So things like WCAG 2.1 and EN 301549, you probably won't be quite so familiar with that, so I'll let you know what that is. But the thing that most people miss is what was happening in France and Italy. Because the European Accessibility Act, or the directive, call it what you like, is an EU thing that then needed to be enacted in all of the different nation states. And sometimes nation states do things differently. And France and Italy had a better idea. So what they require, so this is direct from what they call RGAA4. It's actually 4.1. This came out about the middle of 2019 and was refreshed again last year. Is they don't just want organizations to get to WCAG 2.1 and all of those sorts of things. They want, and in fact, they require public sector organizations to publish a plan for how they're going to get good at accessibility in all sorts of different areas. We've got things in here like the strategy and policy, how much money you're actually sort of dedicating to this. They want to know how you're making sure that staff are skilled, and is that there in recruitment and training and awareness raising. How the internal organization happens of organizations so that they're actually able to deliver accessibility in a way which is repeatable. How to get it into new projects as just part of what those new projects are. Not just user testing, which is there, but also how you're going to take the results of the audits and the user testing and actually make stuff corrected from those. And they want people to actually say, this year, these were the things we said we were going to do, and this is what we've actually achieved at the end of the year. That's very different from the sort of things that you've got in WCAG, which is you've got to get to this technical level. This is saying the organization really needs to get this right. And so we're going to be looking at accessibility from that perspective as well. Effectively, the good news is that most of the international community is coalescing around 3 different standards. They are WCAG 2.1, especially at the level AA, EN 301-549. So if you like, if WCAG is the technical standards for the web, EN 301 actually started out as a procurement standard, but it's very much around, if you like, procurement, not just for web, but also for non-web software and hardware and things like that. And then the final thing, which is the thing that if you've been to any of our webinars, you've heard us talk about a lot, which is ISO 30071 Part 1. That's all about how to make that plan that the French and the Italians are requiring people to publish every year. So that is the reason why this stuff is so important. And so the question is then, how do you get the best out of these things? What should you use for what? And the key thing here is that in some ways it would be really nice if it were just WCAG 2.0 AA is the answer for everything. That would make the world so much easier. The problem is that's not the digital industry that we're in. So WCAG 2.0 AA is pretty good for desktop browsers, websites. It's kind of okay for smartphone, although I'd really want to go to 2.1. But when we're getting to things like native mobile apps, well, actually, Apple and Android have got a big say in those. And actually, a lot of the technologies on the screen here don't really have standards for them. So what is the standard for making something accessible for an Apple Watch or a smart speaker or a games console or anything like this? What's really interesting is when I was doing the research for our webinar last month, what I was finding was a lot of people in the IT departments, for example, of universities were saying that in the past, they assumed that everybody would be using a laptop. But everybody, if you like, coming back to university remotely after Christmas, all of the IT departments were expecting those people to have bought new tech for Christmas. And half of that stuff wasn't your average stuff. It was things like a smart TV or a games console. And they would want to be getting their e-learning via that rather than the PC or the Mac that was kind of like in the corner gathering dust. It matters that when we think about accessibility, we're not just thinking about a website and thinking that a mobile app is us being a little bit edgy. That's like years ago. We're now looking at how we do a digital accessibility across all of this stuff. And talking about all of this stuff, if you were around last month, you would have seen this slide, or at least this is a combination of the things. I was looking at what was happening out of the Consumer Electronics Show, happening virtually, normally happening in Las Vegas. There are loads of new things arriving all of the time. So for example, how do you do accessibility for public health monitoring? How do you do it for robots, for augmented reality and virtual reality and haptics? How do you do it for autonomous cars? Even autonomous cars that have technologies in them that they term adaptive or assistive technologies, which is a term that they've taken from our space. Even things like digital posters. Everything is kind of changing out there. And the thing that is bringing all of this together is the 5G and the Internet of Things. So we want to make sure that we're keeping up with the actual reality of technology rather than just, oh, well, here's what we did 20 years ago when the top tech was a website. So the other thing about all of these is that some of them are definitely for the home, but a lot of them are for when we're back able to be out and about and again. God bless Boris for what he was saying on Monday. We're all looking forward to actually escaping from our homes. But when we do, we'll be really aware that digital is used in different circumstances. And again, WCAG, we're really thinking about a website on a desktop in an office or a home. They weren't really thinking about, can you reach it for example. Which is massively important for things like this. If WeWork is still there when we get out of the pandemic, what you'll find is that it'll probably work the way it used to, which is that you can't sign in at a WeWork until you use a tablet, which is normally on a stand. So you need the tablet itself to have accessibility on it, but you also need to make sure that people can reach it on the stand. And that goes as much for touchscreen ATMs and things like cool stuff that we've been doing for people like the Science Museum, where technology is just part of a physical space. We need to get accessibility working in all of these places. And the right guidelines depend on the type of thing that you're doing. So the right guidelines depend on implementation technologies. So that's the first thing. So for example, if I am doing accessibility for a native app for my iPhone, then I'm going to be coding that app in Swift, not HTML. So therefore, there are different guidelines that I need to be pulling into that process. Coming at it from a really different perspective for a second, if actually I'm your social media person, I'm not going to be putting stuff onto a website at all. I'm going to be putting stuff onto Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or TikTok or whatever else that you're possibly using. So actually knowing how that impacts on what you're able or not able to do when it comes to accessibility is really important. There's then the device or the category. So yeah, if you're putting stuff onto a games console, if you're one of those e-learning people, what do you do? Actually, if you're doing augmented reality, then what do you do? If you're doing games, they're really, really different from a website. Did really WCAG figure what was needed there? No, not really. So there's more coming on that. And then the final thing is your audience. So WCAG themselves, and you'll see it in WCAG 3 when we come onto it, have said that they missed certain populations of the disability community when they created all of the different version 2s of WCAG. The people they specifically missed a lot of the time were people who were autistic and people who had a learning difficulty. They've been trying to write that, but none of that has come through yet. So if you're just using WCAG 2.1 AA, you are still missing huge numbers of people. If you like, those two spaces at the front of your classroom where somebody who's autistic and somebody who has a learning difficulty are supposed to sit, you are not dealing with their needs at all if you're looking at just those guidelines that you've got. So the right guidelines for websites. This is the easy stuff. If you are doing something which is a website and it is only going to be available on the desktop, partly I want to say what century are you living in, but it is possible that some people might just be doing things that can only be sort of like, you know, looked at in big screens. So we've got clients who do really complex kind of data and trading type systems where you really probably don't want to do that mobile, but even they are saying, actually, we want people to do this out and about. So if you really have desktop only, WCAG 2.0 AA is pretty much enough. For everybody else in the real world, 2.1 AA is where you should be at if you are looking at websites in 2021. If you're not there yet, then I would suggest that you very much want to kind of get there as quickly as possible. It's worth it. That's the key thing. If you're doing native apps, things are rather different. As I say, you're coding in Swift, you're coding in Java. You've got those standards from Apple and Android, and you're trying to work out how they hook in with the stuff that you think if you don't follow along with, you could be sued, which is the WCAG stuff. So what you need is to bring together WCAG, notably 2.1 AA, because we're talking mobile here, with what's happening with the techniques that you would get from Apple and Android. And actually, as far back as 2013, we and the BBC were putting together documentation to say, okay, if you're doing a website, it's like this, but if you're doing it in Java, it's like this. If you're doing it in Swift, it's like this. So actually trying to pull these things together. That's the sort of thing that you really need. if you don't have something like that, please get in touch and we can talk you through it. It's not that difficult, if you like, to kind of sort out something which can appear very complicated. The other thing is, and we've done this for a number of our clients, is to actually work out what is missing in Apple and Android stuff, which is a lot about the kind of design patterns for mobile that you would want to do, and making sure that accessibility is in there. You know, there's a lot of questions that really aren't answered in Apple and Android documentation, and so again, we've done a lot of really great stuff there, so that people who are creating native mobile apps for organizations know, you know, the best way of doing notifications for people who are using a screen reader, all of that sort of stuff. What is the right consistent way of doing it? If, and I'm guessing you're probably not, but if you are doing, if you like, non-web software and hardware, EN 301549 is the thing for you. What do I mean by non-web software? I mean things like what we're using right at the moment. So Zoom is an example of what they would term ICT with video. But if we want to think back further in our minds, things like voice over IP, you know, what they did to all of our phones about 10 years ago. It's that sort of thing. It's how to make sure that digital technologies that, if you like, aren't the web are there. And it could be emergency services, or it could be things like authoring tools. We've also got stuff in there about hardware. So for example, a lot of the stuff in the States around how accessible an ebook reader should be. So if you're creating, say, Kindle and you're Amazon, should you need to put a screen reader in it? That's the sort of thing that EN 301549 is really talking about, especially from a perspective of how government might procure or not procure devices that are better or worse for accessibility. And documentation is in there as well. So it's great if you've done all of this stuff, but if you don't tell anybody about it, if they can't find your accessibility documentation to know how to use things, then it's still not quite there. Weirdly, the best place to kind of find this stuff is not, I believe, in the EN 301549 PDF, although you can get that just by popping it into Google. If you actually go to and get the International VPAT, that is a really great summary of what's in there, and a lovely segue to my next slide, which is that if you are selling stuff, so for example, you have a software as a service that you're providing as a website that people can become a member of, or anything like that, then the key thing that you're going to want is that VPAT. So a voluntary product accessibility template, things that in the past used to be really not nice. Because it was mostly a list of things where you said, yes, our product is rubbish for accessibility. That used to be what a VPAT is. Actually, they're a lot better now. 2.4 came out in 2020, about March. And that's a great document for summarizing what is strong and what is weak about the accessibility of a product that you may have created. So it needs to be created after you've done an audit, and ideally after you've found some things that were wrong in the product and fixed them. The three, if you like, aspects of that, the great thing is that the international version starts off with WCAG 2.0, even if you're doing other things that are, if you like, non-web, there's still loads in that which actually crosses those technology boundaries. It brings in section 508, especially for people in the States, and EN 301549 for people in Europe, and also Australia and other parts of the world as well, who are really kind of taking that up. So the next thing, but what happens if you want something specialist? So three examples here of, if you like, if you're doing something a little bit different. So if you're doing a game, for example, this could be a game online on a website. It could be a game for an iPhone. It could be a game for a PS5. Some old colleagues of mine from the BBC did a really great bit of work quite a while ago now to create the game accessibility guidelines. So really great stuff if that's something that you may be anywhere close to. If you are looking at XR, so this is the new name for virtual reality and augmented reality, immersive experiences, the XR Association have done some really great work recently to create guidelines for people creating those immersive experiences who may have a disability. As I say, if that is anywhere near where you may be going to as an organization, it's worth checking out. And then the last example I'm actually going to come back to later on in the session today, which is sometimes you may need to make your own. So WCAG is not good at representing the needs of people who are autistic. The National Autistic Society were really, really clear about that, and they asked us to do some work to try and right that situation. So sometimes you may need to create your own, and that's exactly what we did for them. And then finally, the right guidelines for enabling you to deliver all of this stuff. So if we've looked at the technical guidelines, how do you get your teams to do this? Well, as I say, that is the ISO standard that we've been talking about. And the reason I know about all of these different standards, the technical ones, is because ISO is the one place that kind of pulls them all together and says, actually, you could be creating all sorts of digital things. How do you pick the right ones for the product that you're creating? Or even how do you create the right ones for a whole new technology category that no one's done yet? All of that's in there, as well as the other really important thing, which is making sure that your team can really understand what to use when and how to get really good at things. So I wanted to take a break at that point and to start answering some of your questions. As I say, we've got Pete from the strategic side, Rob from the more kind of technical side on accessibility with me on the call. Pete, yes, Rob, what's the right question to answer first?
Well, we got three really interesting questions. The first one's from Kelly. Around basically how do you test a website, and what about automated tools to see if you pass well or fail WCAG standards?
Sure. Okay. So I can answer that one. Or Rob, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yes. I mean, WCAG is one part of the puzzle really when it comes to testing. Very binary stuff like, keyboard accessibility, which is a WCAG requirement. That's something you can test really easily. But you need to combine that with automated testing where, you're doing the heavy lifting really quickly. You have to be doing, automate what you can. But ultimately, then you want to be testing your core journeys with people with disabilities to get the best outcome. WCAG will give you, some binary results of pass and fail, yes, but it doesn't give you the whole picture of whether the product is actually going to be usable for people.
Yeah, I mean, in general, you'll see something about automated tools when I talk about WCAG 3.0 soon. So yeah, use them for what they're good at, not for what they're not. Pete, next question.
We had another question, interesting question from Freudis. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And he's often involved with conflict between UX designers and the technical team about the interpretation of the standards. How do you cope with that?
Yeah, and I've seen another one from him there about sort of tenders for LMS services starting to contain something about accessibility. Yeah, I mean, the key thing really that they were trying to do with EN 301549 was to enable people who are procuring things. So I'm not making it myself, I'm actually choosing of which of these digital products out there is the right thing for me. They were doing it initially from a public sector viewpoint, but it goes as much for the private sector as well. It was very much around, if you like, what questions to ask. When it comes to what's learning management system to buy, it's always a really difficult one to answer because we've never met one yet that we think is perfect when it comes to accessibility. Each has strengths and weaknesses. We're actually putting in the equivalent of an LMS hassle inclusion at the moment for a community idea that we're creating. And in the end, our decision was we need to be in control of this and to be able to change this, because we can't find anything off the shelf which is accessible enough for us to put our brand to. So it's really important that when you're doing that procurement, you ask those right questions. It's the reason why it's there in those procurement standards like EN 301549. It's also one of the things that the ISO 30071 Part 1 is really, really strong on, which is that a lot of times in the past, people have assumed that the important thing in accessibility was to know how to create an accessible website. You know, a long time ago, we worked out that actually the way you create an accessible website was the way everyone else does, which is you cobble together content management systems and JavaScript libraries and all these kind of different components. And the job is not so much about making sure that you know how to code HTML and CSS, but actually how you were able to ask the right questions, if you like, of all of these tool vendors, so that you knew actually, if I choose this library or this management system or whatever, it's actually going to uphold the accessibility we want. And if it's not perfect, what do we do about it? So yeah, a key thing really to try and make sure that you get really good at. Again, we have training in those areas. So if there are particular challenges you have, happy to help.
Okay, I guess we've got time for one more in this section. And I noticed some other questions which you can probably bring to the next questions. But
Right.
Similar to that last one, Dean has asked kind of like, his first question was, what's the best way to implement accessibility on a website? But he then went to say, so how do you design it? Do you design it website to website or a generic solution? And I wonder if that's similar to what you said about these component things.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing a lot with helping organizations actually create a component library that has accessibility built into it, not just in the design, but also in the code. You know, there are a number out there already. You know, gov.uk have a good one. IBM's Carbon is really good. The key thing is that most organizations actually want to create their own, because they have their own brand, their own way of doing things. And the key thing, you know, what's the best way to implement accessibility on a website? There's only one answer really to that, is from the very beginning. You need to make sure that you know what it is about your website, which is the same as all of the rest of the generic solutions, if you like, and what is different. It could be that the generic solutions are going to be enough for you, or a generic solution that you can customize would be sufficient. But you need to know, you know, what makes my website different. And oftentimes that comes down to things like, what audience is it for? What platforms is it going to go on, you know, and what is the culture in our organization, so that we can make sure that we have the right skills to be able for, you know, to deal with that new JavaScript library or whatever it is. So all of this stuff gets quite complicated and is very much about how the team works together, and all of the elements of the team know what they need to do to deliver an accessible product. That's the sort of thing that ISO 30071's activities are really good at, because if you like, all of the things that make a difference, all of the things that make your product different from the one of the person maybe in a different department of your company or in a different company, they're all in there to say, this is the stuff that you need to think about right from the beginning, so you've got the best chance of getting a great result. Good stuff. Thanks, Pete. Let's move on with WCAG, and then we've got some more time at the end to take some more questions from there. So yeah, if you could ready those up for later. And thank you for your questions. As I say, if we don't get around to all of them in the session, we'll have a log of the chat at the end. And if there are particular ones and we can get back to you, we'll try and do that after the session. But the thing that most people really care about is WCAG, because I'm guessing that most people on the call are probably not doing games or things that you know, the one thing that everybody does is websites. And WCAG was designed for that. What's it doing? Well, effectively, we've had about 20 years of WCAG now, WCAG 1.0, WCAG 2.0, and after 20 years, we finally got to the place where most people are going with 2.1 AA. It's not a bad set of standards if you are creating websites for desktop and mobile. But lots of change is coming. So by the middle of the year, if they're to be believed, I think it's going to be a bit later, but we'll see. WCAG 2.2 is going to have arrived. And by the end of next year, WCAG 3.0 will have arrived, again, if they stick to schedule. So I wanted to just give you just 5 minutes on what these two new things that are coming mean for you. And we're going to look at strengths and weaknesses of them, and we're going to look at opportunities and threats to you as people who, I'm guessing, own websites or manage websites or some other form of digital tool. So WCAG 2.2, the subtitle is a bit of a mess, and I'm really sorry to say that, but that is our considered opinion, and it's not just ours, it's loads of people's. What is WCAG 2.2? It's an evolution of 2.1. It's basically 9 new checkpoints that they're adding to the 70 odd that are there in WCAG 2.0 and 2.1. The ideas behind it are good, but the execution is leaving a lot to be desired at the moment. The other thing, and most people will probably forget, is that it's also defining a number of unit tests, which will be helpful for people who are creating automated tools or people who are training people in how to test things. But in general, the strengths of this are very few because the weaknesses are huge. Don't take our word for it. WebAIM got there before we published our blog, so we decided not to. But it is a mess. Of the 9 that they came up with, WebAIM currently supported 1 of them being ready to go and the other 8 not being ready to go. I don't think we'd have been any more charitable than that. It's pretty much a load of things that are kind of interesting and kind of useful, but really badly thought through at the moment. So what to do about 2.2? There are no opportunities, I think, for product creators from this. There's nothing in here that's going to make you loads of money. The threat is loads of noise that you could do without because you've just gotten to grips with 2.1. It's got no discernible value. Ignore it. Moving on. Because this is where all of the brain power behind the people who are putting together WCAG standards is at the moment, which is 3.0. So, you know, it's almost like 2.2 is the little iteration that everyone forgot. All of the people with the brain power went into 3.0. 3.0, the subtitle, great ideas, but very costly. So what is it? It's designed to be a big bang, unlike 2.2, which is an evolution. 3.0 is designed to be a revolution. So they're effectively saying, let's throw it all away, start again, and create something that we should have done the first time. It's a strong basis on which they can add guidelines like literally every year going forwards. That may make you go, yay! That may make you go, oh my word, sorry. So every year there's going to be a new lot of WCAG to try and get our head around. Yeah, that's the thing that's happening here. The good thing is that unlike 2.0 and the rest of them, the scoring in this is additive, not percentage. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you can imagine things at the moment, the worst thing about WCAG is that you need to get all of AA to, you know, perfectly done. So all of the single A and the double A in WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 to be compliant. If you like, it's a standard that's based on perfection. Then they kind of went, oh, actually, that doesn't work. So you can be partially compliant. So if you like, you can be like 80% of the way to this thing. But whenever you have this thing, if you are then adding more guidelines to it, you then have a problem, because you then need to say we're 100% on 2.0, we're 80% on 2.1, and it just becomes a mess. Nobody is encouraged to do more. The new thing basically says you get points for doing good things. And the more good things you do, the more points you get, which allows them to say, oh, hey, those people that we forgot, like people who are neurodiverse, we're going to add in a new bunch of guidelines for them. And if you do those as well, you get more points than the other guys who just ignored them. That's the sort of thing that's happening. Which is a really good thing. The other thing that they've tried to do, which is kind of a really good thing, but awful at the same time, is they've tried to make everything clearer. So they did a lot of user research about how easy it was to understand WCAG. And what they found was that everybody thought it was just a complete dog's dinner and they didn't understand it. So rather than, if you like, do an iterative change, they're changing everything. So they're changing the structure, they're changing the numbering, they're changing the detail, lots of things about it. So for example, anybody who kind of said, all of that color contrast stuff, it feels a little bit antiquated because all of the research was done 20 years ago when we were talking about offices all of the time. And also, I'm not totally sure it's right. Yeah, you are right. And they've been hiding from that for ages. They are changing everything, which is a great thing if you know nothing about accessibility yet. If you know loads about accessibility, you will be spending loads of time trying to work out what word you should be using for the thing that you've known for years, and what number that is and how it all fits together. They're changing everything, and it's going to be a real problem. It also changes the rules around conformance and testing in really useful ways. So thankfully, it's actually catching up with the rest of the world. So things like you don't have to test your entire thing. All of that WCAG EO, the evaluation methodology, they're really starting to pull through, and they're starting to pull out stuff from ISO 30071 Part 1 that starts talking about the importance of user journeys. That's really, really key. So they are catching up on that. You know, if you've got loads of problems in your product, but they are all on pages that no one goes to, that's not as important as problems on your homepage and problems on the key pages on your site. They're finally catching up with that, which is really good. They're also finally catching up with the idea of what Rob was talking about earlier. Which is WCAG 2.0 was all based around, can I test it with an automated tool? WCAG 3.0 is, well, actually, there's loads of stuff that are really important that you can't test with an automated tool. In fact, you can't even test with a manual audit. You need a user there to tell you whether you've got it right or not. User testing. And this is the stuff that's been there in ISO 30071 for a couple of years now, where we're saying, okay, you can get to a good technical level, but the next level up from there is, can people actually use your thing? So they get a great experience across the whole of your product rather than just every individual page being okay. That's the sort of stuff which is coming through, which is really good. So strengths, if people adopt it, it's going to be much better for people with disabilities. It's better researched, it's much fairer. It includes groups that haven't been included so far. Yay for people with a disability. This will be a good thing. Weaknesses, they've taken out AAA and AAA completely. So there is, so to try and be fair, everything is exactly the same now. So nobody will know which things will help millions of people and which may help only thousands. So things like our accessibility issue prioritization matrix are going to be massively important, I think, going forwards. There are some opportunities for product creators. I think certainly a lot of the companies that we know are looking at it going, oh, that's great. WCAG are catching up with how we test things in our organization. So the flexibility of scoping testing is going to be great. The threats are horrific, though. that every single training course is going to need to have to be re-architected and restructured. And once you've done it this year, you're going to need to do it again to add in the new things next year, and the new things and the new things. If you were having trouble keeping up with WCAG 2.0 or 2.1, you ain't seen nothing yet. And that goes double for tools, because the tools will all have to change as well. But there is a real incentive for the tool makers to do that, because unless they change it, you can't test against WCAG 3.0 unless you buy an automated tool. Now that to me reeks of cronyism, unless there is some organization in the accessibility sphere who is going to give an automated tool for free. I don't like it when accessibility people create, if you like, the market for their own products in quite such an obvious way. Automated testing is really, really important. There are some free things out there, but they're not enough to do what 3.0 says at the moment. So wait and see what happens on that. What's going to happen? The costs are really high. The benefits are much less clear for companies. So unless this gets into legislation, everyone is going to avoid it. The Accessibility Guidelines Working Group know this, because this is their quote. They expect that some organizations may wish to continue using WCAG 2.x, so that's 2.0 and 2.1, while others may wish to migrate to the new standard. Read that like, give it 5 years, and maybe some people might. Because this is, I don't know if you remember the Big Bang in the city, it's that. You can be brilliant at accessibility and still find this really, really hard to get to. If you can get to it, it's great. But even in places where some of this stuff is already in legislation, like in Europe, in France and Italy, I reckon nobody is going to legislate on this for a while, or if they do, we can't afford it as a community of people who create websites. So 3.0, a lot of possibilities, a lot of cost. We have a full strategic paper on that if you need, that we've created for some of our clients who really just wanted to get ahead of this. So yeah, it isn't backwards compatible. So Craig, yeah, and it won't be. Because they don't want it to be. It's a complete big bang. You've got 2, you've got 3, the 2 don't mix. You will have to make a decision at some point. And so therefore most people will make a decision to stay with where they're at. That's my feeling, but we'll see. And just the last couple of sections, making your own. So you might want to make your own standards. The reason you would do this is because your audiences aren't covered by things. I mentioned already what we did with the National Autistic Society. WCAG is really bad at understanding the needs of people with disabilities who are neurodiverse, especially people who are autistic. And also a lot of the research was very contradictory out there. So we did a lot of desk research, talking to a lot of sort of experts. We did an online survey with 400 people who are autistic, and did focus groups to really understand their needs. If you want to understand the needs of the people who use your stuff, you might want to do this same sort of thing. And hopefully the NAS guidelines will be coming out sometime this year. You also may want to make guidelines easier for your teams to understand. So we've been doing this again for years. So providing clarity on the stuff that's in WCAG, examples, do this, don't do that, all that sort of stuff is really, really helpful for your teams. We've helped a lot of companies do this. As I say, if that's something you need, we'd be really happy to help you. It can be a very, very good thing. Nobody wants to read WCAG. Segmentation by roles is massively important in there, and making sure that each one of those roles, if you like, has got the big kind of picture about what designers need to do, what governance people need to do, that sort of thing. So if you need any of that stuff, please get in touch. As I say, we have ways of enabling you to have local guidelines that work for your teams, your culture, your processes in a really efficient way. And then the last section, and I don't want to spend long on ISO, so Pete, ready some questions. As I say, if you want lots of this stuff, we've got loads of ISO on our website, in my books, all of those sorts of things. But if you haven't figured it yet, ISO is about getting good at accessibility throughout your organization. It's a way of saying, okay, if we're in France or Italy, for example, how do we make that 3-year plan? This is the way of seeing where you're at the moment and where you're not good, and that's where the plan comes from. There are 5 elements of this, but what I wanted to do was to just relate this to what's happening in France and Italy. So the things that they were requiring there, for example, where is accessibility in your digital policy? How are you allocating resource to this? Where is it in the way you do skills? If you're using an external company like ourselves, how do you make sure you don't get dependent on them and actually take skills in-house rather than just getting dependent on another accessibility company? How do you do governance and organize this internally? And how do you make sure that when you're buying tools, like all of us have been doing a lot this year for your staff, that you have accessibility in that procurement? So it's not just those LMSs, it's as much this Zoom that we're using. There's stuff in there about the process, so taking accessibility into account really early in projects, making sure that user testing is there, that sort of thing. And not only doing audits, but working out when are the right time to do audits so you get best value for money, and what you're going to do with the results of them, not just testing, but fixing. And also, they've got in there requiring people to actually say, this is our plan, and these are the results. And that's something that we've loved to see, because that's a fundamental part of our strategy to try and get companies to say, what is this doing for us as a business? You know, have we been successful? Is the way we're doing accessibility right? Is it actually helping our customers? Is it helping our staff? Is it helping our bottom line as a business? Those sorts of results are the things that are, if you like, really important for companies. So we can help you get there. We've got tools that enable you to see where you're at and plan to where you might want to be. And it brings all of these things together. So it says, these are the technical guidelines for using for different types of products. This is how to bring usability and accessibility together. This is how to maybe get the best out of inclusive design process. Things like Microsoft creating their inclusive design toolkit. The Engineering Design Centre here in the UK have done brilliant stuff there as well. Can you get really good stuff out of those? Procurement, we've mentioned already, and also kind of managerial stuff, which is, okay, if we want to get mature, how do we do accessibility maturity models in a way that all of our staff who know maturity models can understand? All of that is there. This is a quote from Dathif. I think he was actually on our December thing. You know, the bigger picture approach is a breath of fresh air. You know, it empowers us to take an organizational wide approach. So if you want this sort of stuff, we've got a scorecard for it on our website. We also have kind of books and training as well. So Pete, some final kind of questions from folks before we need to go.
Sure, we got a couple of types of question. There were several people who are looking at apps. So Kirsty, I think it's Kirsty Baker, was saying, I'm building apps, but I'm not quite sure how WCAG fits with apps. How should I approach that?
Sure. So, I mean, the long story short is WCAG want their standards to apply to everything. So they really don't like the fact that they're not in control of the app ecosystem. They are in control of HTML and CSS. So they would say that all of the core principles behind WCAG apply as much to apps as everything else. And they're kind of right from a principles perspective. But as I say, it's what was on my slide, really. You've got Apple and Android stuff over here, which is all about APIs and what you need to put into your product. And then you've got WCAG there that somebody in your organization is saying it's got to be WCAG compliant. The two of these things can come together, but it's really complicated to work that out unless you ask us questions and you talk to us about our framework, and the whole idea of that is to bring these things together. So yeah, we can help you through that to enable your teams to understand whether it's websites or apps you're doing. This is how, if you like, a WCAG and these other things play together in a good way.
There was another question came from Darren, which is, we got a global product. How do we cope with the different standards around the world? You know, do we need to do France and Italy first, or the USA? What?
Yeah, great question, Darren. So, I mean, we work with people all over the globe. You know, tomorrow morning, I'm training people in the Far East. You know, middle of the week, I was doing the Middle East, Australia, Asia Pacific, America, Canada. You know, we're doing loads of stuff for organizations here in Europe who are trying to work out how to handle Italy and France. The important thing is to know what you can do that travels, if you like. The reason I was really careful on my slide there to say it was Italy and France is that they actually have very similar requirements, but you just need to understand how they express them. So that 3-year plan that one of our clients went, well, we really have to do this just for our French subsidiary. Then we found the Italian stuff, and it's kind of like, okay, we're now doing it for France and Italy. It could be that other parts of Europe might want this as well going forward. So the thing to do is to try and work out what happens locally and how that comes together with what you can do to make things happen globally. And as I say, it's not easy. You know, we've had to do a lot of kind of translation from French and Italian, and you know, we're working with the Israeli government, for example, who are interested in putting ISO 30071 Part 1 into their laws, Australia, all of these different things. Most of this stuff is coming together. You just need a map to do that. At the moment, we haven't written the map because we're so busy advertising, helping people who need it on an individual basis. So if we can help you, then please let us know. At some point, we'll hopefully slow down enough to be able to kind of try and draw some of these things out and maybe put a webinar on. But in general, yeah, if you need specific help, and probably your lawyers will want specific help, because that's what we're doing with other companies, then please let us know.